Hi, I'm Allison Burke from the Good Food Institute. GFI is a team of scientists, entrepreneurs, lawyers, and corporate engagement specialists who are focused on using markets and food technology to create a sustainable, healthy, and just food system. You can check us out and learn more at gfi.org. For the agenda for Lecture 1, we're going to be talking about land use and efficiency, environmental impact and greenhouse gases, diet and changing approaches to new products, and which companies are making plant-based meat and clean meat, eggs, and dairy. The topic for this week is why do we need plant-based and clean meat? One of the questions that drives our work at the Good Food Institute is how can we feed 10 billion people by 2050 through systems that do not negatively impact climate, biodiversity, and scarce natural resources? Looking at the total available land on the Earth's surface, 71% of which is habitable, half is devoted to agriculture. And of the land devoted to agriculture, 77% is used for livestock, while only 23% grows crops. But we know that the majority of the calories and even the majority of the protein available for human consumption comes from plant-based food, from that 23% devoted to cropland. So as the population increases, this starts to look unsustainable. We could be using more of that livestock purpose land to grow crops and drastically increase the amount of calories and protein that we have available to feed people. Looking within the U.S. specifically, we see a similar pattern. Livestock, that huge yellow square in the middle, takes up drastically more land than the smaller green rectangle of food we eat, and we're also using that tan area to the right of the livestock rectangle to grow the feed that sustains the livestock. We don't need to be doing this. We could increase the amount of land devoted to food we eat by decreasing the amount of land devoted to livestock feed or cow pasturing and feed many more people more sustainably. We're familiar with some of the other problems attendant on animal agriculture as well. The UN has said that animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale, from local to global, and we can see some of those effects around us. On the left, we see waste runoff from factory farms and aquaculture. The middle image represents the crop monoculture and more generally the land use devoted to crops that will feed, inefficiently, animals raised for meat. And on the right is a representation of the clear-cutting of forests to provide pasture and grazing land for beef cattle, thereby eliminating biodiversity, affecting soil health and ecosystem health, and reducing air quality enhancements and carbon sinks provided by old-growth forests. So instead of devoting more of our land to growing crops that feed us, here's what we're doing instead. As an illustration of the sustainability problem with our current food system, consider the chicken, the most efficient of the animals used in industrial animal agriculture. Considering the chicken as a simple system with feed calories in and food calories out, the chicken requires 9 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food. The remaining 8 are spent on breathing, moving, thinking, and other metabolic processes just like you and me. Why not remove that inefficiency and create food directly from plants or cells? And not only is it inefficient, it's bad for animals, bad for human health, creates food security issues, and is terrible for the environment. As a side note, if you think the inefficiency of the chicken is something we can engineer away with better genetic tools or CRISPR, keep in mind that poultry scientists have already been breeding larger and larger chickens, to the point where today's chickens barely resemble the full-grown chickens of the 50s or the 70s, and many have breasts so large and heavy that they can't stand up when fully grown. We can't make the chicken much more efficient because it needs to breathe and move around and grow all of the other parts of its body that we don't end up eating, but which are essential to its ability to grow from egg to chick to chicken. Despite the inefficiencies of this system, and despite growing awareness of land constraints to expand herds and grow more animals, meat production continues to increase, primarily by factory farming, raising more animals with fewer resources. Thus, the amount of meat produced continues to increase. Of course, the production of meat isn't increasing in a vacuum. It's also driven by global demand for meat. We know that as a population industrializes, it starts to eat more of a Western diet, which means a diet that is more meat-heavy and that has meat at more meals than before. Projections for meat demand based on 2005 levels show that we're expected to eat a lot more meat by 2050, and particularly a lot more chicken. That meat will have to come from somewhere, though hopefully it doesn't have to come from the same system that we've been using to produce it. What is plant-based meat? Any substitute for animal-based meat that is made from plants or fungi can be considered plant-based meat. Usually, plant-based meat products attempt to mimic in taste and appearance a particular animal-based meat product like a chicken breast or ground beef, but this isn't a strict requirement. Products like tofu and seitan can also be used as plant-based meats and can be shaped and cooked in different ways to replace animal-based meat in a variety of dishes. You may be most familiar with veggie burgers or veggie dogs that replace animal meat hot dogs at a picnic, for example. A first question you might have about plant-based meat is where it comes from. Plants, sure, but which ones, and whose idea was this? Plant-based meats have been produced and consumed by humans around the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, you may have heard a lot of buzz recently about the Impossible Burger or the Beyond Burger, or been introduced to veggie burgers in the 90s when the Clinton White House served them, and advertisements for the Garden Burger aired during the season finale of Seinfeld. Plant-based meat has a long tradition that incorporates a variety of religious and environmentally conscious practices. While concern for animals can be related to spiritual and religious practices, some of the earliest plant-based meats were developed not by animal rights advocates, but by Buddhists and Seventh-day Adventists whose religious teachings forbade the consumption of animals. These products, made from soybeans, nuts, and wheat, were refined and experimented upon by manufacturers to produce new textures, flavors, and shapes that mimic various animal meat products or produce wholly new types of food. The earliest recorded use of plant-based meat, in this case tofu, is found in 965 AD in a Chinese text promoting the consumption of imitation lamb for frugality. Yuba, a Japanese term for tofu, is later recorded in 1587, while wheat-based tempeh is first mentioned in writing in Indonesia in 1815. Of course, these are likely not the first times these products were made or consumed ever. They're just the first times we've found historical texts that unambiguously reference them. The first recorded use of plant-based meat in the United States comes a few years later in 1852, when a local New Hampshire newspaper reported on a resident's development of a vegetable sausage, noting that vegetarian-only boarding houses have long wanted such a product. In 1896, the first plant-based meat entrepreneur, John Harvey Kellogg, invented two products, Protos and Nuttos. Both are nut-based, while Nuttos is actually made of peanuts, which are a legume, and we'll talk later about the advantages and disadvantages of using nuts, legumes, pulses, grains, and plants in meat substitutes. But both products were developed for religious reasons. John Harvey Kellogg was a physician and a Seventh-day Adventist who directed the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a kind of hospital-hotel founded and run by Adventists. Kellogg was a nutritionist and a health advocate before it was cool, and while you're likely to recognize him today for his invention of cornflakes, he was an early promoter of a vegetarian diet and vegetarian foods. Kellogg was also likely the first person to submit a patent for a plant-based meat, though the patent wasn't granted until 1901. In 1911, a soy entrepreneur in France patented a range of soy-based deli and butchery products, and a variety of commercialized soy products followed. In 1947, Robert Boyer, a former Ford engineer who was attempting to produce synthetic wool from soybeans, used textile manufacturing tools to produce textured spun soy fiber. This protein fiber had good elastic and elongation properties, did not wet as easily as wool, and was approximately 80% as strong as wool. More importantly, it could be shaped and layered in the same manner as meat fibers. Before long, the companies Worthington and Ralston Purina had commercialized the fibers and were producing plant-based meat products. Because the fibers didn't heat well, the products they made were frozen. In the following decades, several plant-based meat companies were launched, including Morningstar Farms and Eve's, both of which are still found in grocery stores today. In the 90s, growing health consciousness led to the development of the Boca Burger and Tofurkey, and the restaurant chains Subway, Denny's, and Chili's began serving veggie burgers nationwide. In 1999, the FDA officially proclaimed that consuming soy protein can reduce the risk of heart disease, and in 2002, after years of regional testing, Burger King put a veggie burger on its permanent menu. While the veggie burgers of the 90s were healthy, convenient, and relatively tasty, the new millennium ushered in the era of food engineers turning their talents to plant-based meat with the goal of making plant-based meat that was indistinguishable from animal meat. Beyond Meat was founded in 2009 by food scientist Ethan Brown, and in 2011, Impossible Foods was founded by Stanford biochemist Pat Brown, no relation. In 2014, Beyond Meat released the Beast Burger, which has more iron than a 4-ounce serving of beef, 24 grams of protein, more calcium than a cup of milk, and more omegas than 4 ounces of salmon. In multiple taste tests, participants can't differentiate the patties from meat. The company's flagship products, the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger, both came out in 2016 and were marketed as plant-based meat that bleeds like beef due to beet juice and soy-like hemoglobin, respectively, about which we will learn more later. Here's another way to look at the sustainability of different sources of protein. The dotted line separates plant-based foods from animal-based foods, showing the drastic differences in freshwater consumption, land use, and greenhouse gas emissions from producing legumes, wheat, soy, and fruits and vegetables, compared to pork, eggs, fish, poultry, dairy, and beef. Although beef is by far the worst offender in terms of resources used to produce the same quantity of food, all of the animal-based protein sources compared here are much more wasteful than the plant-based foods that can be used to replace them. Researchers are working on performing this type of analysis on clean meat, but because the manufacturing processes for clean meat are still under development, we don't have very accurate estimates for some of these factors. Drilling down to the water usage bar of the previous chart, we can compare the water usage per kilocalorie or per gram of protein for plant-based and animal-based food items. Growing fruits and nuts is more water-intensive per gram of protein than growing animal meat, but pulses, a category of food that contains legumes, beans, and chickpeas, cereals, roots, and vegetables, can provide the same amount of protein for less water, and the overall water footprint of beef, based on the production and consumption data from 2014, showed that beef production uses more than twice as much water as the next closest animal meat, and more than 3 times as much as the cultivation of pulses. Land usage is also a prominent concern, and we can evaluate land usage even by the individual meal. This graph shows the amount of land needed to produce a typical meat dish eaten for lunch in square meters per person. More than 3.5 square meters of land is needed to produce a single hamburger, and on average, every American eats 3 hamburgers per week. Our food choices also leave a carbon footprint. The more animal products we eat, the greater our carbon footprint. This graph shows how 4 ounces of food compares to miles driven. Fruits, vegetables, beans at the top of the graphic are the foods with the lowest carbon footprints, while animal products have the highest carbon footprints. The Environmental Working Group, which produced this graph, is the nation's largest environmental research and advocacy organization. Oxfam summed it up this way: eating less meat is a simple way to reduce the pressure on global resources and help ensure that everyone has enough to eat. Eating less meat helps fight hunger. Oxfam is an international confederation of 17 organizations working in approximately 94 countries worldwide to find solutions to poverty. Their message is that if we can shift the population away from eating meat, we can feed more people. There is an increase in the number of consumers who are now eating what's been coined a flexitarian diet. The term flexitarian is a combination of the 2 words flexible and vegetarian and refers to a predominantly plant-based diet that also includes dairy, eggs, fish, and meat, although in smaller percentages. So, is there any hope of innovating ourselves out of this position? One analogy used is the transition from horse-based transportation to automobiles and electric transportation. Horses were actually a huge problem for cities. You may not know it, but it was not just because they were slow or caused traffic jams. In 1890, more than 175,000 horses were living in New York, producing 50,000 tons of manure per month. In 1898, the world's first international urban planning conference was actually called off because no solution could be discerned. Then, 10 years later in 1908, the Model T was introduced. This was the first mass-produced automobile. By 1912, there were more cars in New York than horses, and the problem was almost solved. Now, Tesla and other innovators are changing consumer demand for transport and pushing automobiles themselves toward more sustainable sources of fuel, like hybrid fuel cells and electric batteries. So let's focus now on the technological solutions to our outdated, inefficient system of animal ag. What is the solution to animal agriculture and our meat-heavy diet? How do we get the food system to shift to healthy, sustainable, humane foods? Bill Gates has invested in plant-based protein companies and calls out that we've only explored 8% of the world's plant proteins as potential meat alternatives. That means we might be missing plant proteins that closely mimic animal proteins in taste, texture, structure, or binding capability, and we may also be able to source plant proteins from a greater variety of crops than are currently grown or processed for use in plant-based and protein-heavy products. An example of a novel plant-based protein product that we'll talk about more in a following lecture solely devoted to plant-based foods is the Impossible Burger. Made by the company Impossible Foods, the Impossible Burger is composed of textured wheat protein, coconut oil, potato protein, and heme derived from plants, which gives it a bloody taste. We'll talk more later about how that heme compound is produced because it's very interesting and has brought up some issues about how these novel types of products are assessed for safety and regulation. The Impossible Burger provides 21 grams of protein, which is more than the 19 grams in the typical beef burger, and it uses 1/20th the amount of land, 1/4 the amount of water, and produces 1/8 the amount of greenhouse gases. It also, in my opinion, tastes very good. Another option developed at around the same time by the company Beyond Meat is the Beyond Burger. This plant-based burger also provides 20 grams of protein, and it's pea protein, so this burger contains no soy or gluten. Its coloration and bleeding appearance is provided by beet juice. Here's what they look like being cooked. The appearance is very similar to a beef burger with slightly less visible texture. There are also very convincing plant-based chicken products available, as well as plant-based ranch dressing, mayonnaise, cookie dough, cake mixes, pancake mix, and scrambled plant-based egg. This company, Just, is targeting the food service market with this line of products in particular. Clean meat is the second replacement for conventional animal-grown meat that we'll be discussing in this class. Clean meat refers to meat that is grown using biotechnological methods like cell culture and tissue engineering to produce a product that is cellularly identical to meat grown in an animal, but which doesn't require the use of a living body. If you're familiar with the idea that we can grow replacement organs or tissues in a lab, then you understand the basic concept behind clean meat. Animal cells, which can be obtained non-invasively, can be induced via biotechnology to divide, proliferate, and expand, and reform the tissues they would have formed in an animal's body, or often any tissue that animal could have grown, and can thereby produce very large quantities of tissue without harming or killing animals. Given how plant-based meat products are advancing, you may wonder why we need clean meat at all. We have reason to believe that most people won't want to switch all of their meat consumption to plant-based meat. Animal-based meat is involved in a number of cultural and religious traditions, and many people view eating meat as an important part of their identity, whether for gender, culture, regional, or national aspects of identity. Taking as a guideline Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there are a number of societal and physiological levels on which eating meat helps form identity. Food security, or feeling that one has enough to eat, is the initial level of this feeling of security, and the systems that arise to share food, develop rituals around cooking, determine who has higher societal value based on what they eat, and the development of religious rituals have all involved animal products in various cultures around the world. Assuming we are able to encourage people to shift from animal-based meat to clean meat while retaining their community and social identities, here's the difference in environmental impact of a shift to clean meat. The size of the bubble represents greenhouse gas emissions. Land is on the left axis, energy on the bottom axis. It's a dramatic difference. Clean meat would use 7 to 45% less energy, 99% less land, 82 to 96% less water, and would produce 78 to 96% less greenhouse gases. These are estimates based on current production methods for clean meat, mostly in analogy to other biotechnology products produced in similar settings. Animal agriculture also poses a threat to public health, simply through the raising of livestock in crowded conditions with lots of antibiotic use, and in areas where different species of animals are kept in open pens or pastures next to one another, allowing zoonoses to spread between host species, or allowing livestock to be infected by local wild birds and bats that can interact with animals raised for food. Antibiotic resistance is a problem that arises from the continued and extensive use of antibiotics, giving bacteria the opportunity to acquire resistance to these drugs. And zoonoses similarly arise as a natural part of the life cycle of disease-causing organisms, which are continually on the hunt for new and better host organisms. An estimated 75% of the new diseases that have affected humans over the past 10 years, such as the West Nile virus, originate from the raising of animals or from animal products. Clean meat is also naturally capable of producing products that look exactly like their animal-grown counterparts. This is the first cultured beef burger, and while it lacked the fat that would normally be part of ground beef, when cooked in vegetable oil, as in the image on the right, it behaved the same as beef grown in an animal in terms of coloration, texture, and smell. Similarly, Memphis Meats produced the first cultured meatball with a very similar appearance to animal-grown meatballs in 2016. In the future, meat might be produced in a facility like this, a future meat brewery. This facility doesn't need to use any antibiotics or hormones and doesn't produce any waste or suffering, unlike traditional animal agriculture. These machines are fermenters, which can be used to grow cultured or lab-grown meat. What's great is they can be completely transparent, unlike traditional animal agriculture that is protected by so-called ag-gag laws that make it illegal to take pictures of or videotape factory farms. Along with clean meat, some companies are looking into producing clean versions of other animal products. Clean milk proteins can be made by fermenting yeast that have been engineered to turn sugar into milk proteins. There's no yeast in the final product. The yeast excrete the milk proteins alone without any added hormones or lactose that can have unwanted health effects in humans. The milk proteins are then combined with plant fats, vitamins, and minerals to produce a clean milk product. This method of using yeast to produce proteins that are beneficial in some way to human industries isn't new to the clean meat or the clean animal product sector. This is how rennet, the enzyme used to make cheese, insulin used to treat human diabetics, and even vanillin, the main chemical in vanilla flavor that can be very expensive to grow from the vanilla bean, are made. This process uses 65% less energy than traditional dairy farming, 91% less land, 98% less water, and produces 84% less greenhouse gas emissions. Another company making a clean animal product is Clara Foods, which is producing animal-free egg whites that foam and bind and fluff. Egg whites are 90% water, 10% protein, and contain no cholesterol, but it takes over 600 gallons of water to make a dozen eggs, which is very inefficient considering how little food comes out the other end of the process. Making egg whites directly from yeast that produce the relevant proteins uses 5 times less water than making egg whites by using the chicken's reproductive system. As Richard Branson, an investor in clean meat company Memphis Meats, has said, both clean and plant-based meats will remove the need for the killing of animals for meat. Several large food producers, including those predominantly associated with meat production like Tyson and Cargill, are investing in clean and plant-based meat companies. They understand that they are in the business of providing protein in whichever form the consumer demands, and that if innovations are changing how that protein is produced, they want to be involved. Some of the companies invested in include those we've mentioned like Beyond Meat and Memphis Meats, as well as even newer players like Future Meat Technologies and Supermeat. The questions these companies have to answer, and which we'll dive into in the later sections of this course, are how we can deconstruct meat and animal products and leverage biology and biochemistry to reconstruct them. At the cellular level, we want to know whether we can grow the precise ratios and arrangements of animal cells to form the desired products, but without the animal. At the molecular level, we want to know if we can identify the same molecules, or molecules that mimic them, in other kingdoms of life. This means substituting plant proteins for animal proteins and plant fats for animal fats, but it also means finding molecules like the heme that is found in the roots of nitrogen-fixing plants but is a structural analog for the hemoglobin found in animal blood. In some cases, we want to produce the exact same animal-based molecules in new production hosts, as when yeast or bacteria are engineered to produce animal proteins without going through an animal. Alternative protein production platforms can be separated into 4 main categories based on inputs and methods, and we'll talk about all of these in this course. Plant-based proteins can be sourced from a variety of plant sources and engineered in creative ways to mimic the structural and functional roles of animal-based proteins. Cell culture, for any type of cells, uses basic building blocks, carbohydrates, fats, and amino acids, to produce animal products in novel ways. In some sense, these inputs are more fungible. All biological material is comprised of these same building blocks. These components can be derived by breaking down biomass that's totally unsuitable as direct food or feed. You can choose any crop that grows well in a given area and can be broken down into its constituent parts easily without catering to things like taste or digestibility by a ruminant. The key takeaways from this lecture on clean and plant-based meat are an introduction to why current methods of animal agriculture are a problem, and what new products like clean and plant-based meat are doing to address this problem. Plant-based meat, or food made from plants and fungi that are meant to take the place of animal-based meat in the diet, are one means of answering the question of how we can healthfully and sustainably feed an increasing population on a warming planet with a static supply of land. Clean meat, or meat made from cells through biotechnological methods of growing tissue outside of a body, is another promising product for reducing the impact of animal agriculture on our environment. In future lectures, we'll dive deeper into the biology behind both clean and plant-based meat, as well as how these products are being marketed and what the economic landscape is for their adoption by consumers. If you found this lecture to be of interest, you can find out much more at gfi.org.